It is said that the most beautiful weddings in London are often the quietest funerals. Behind the shimmering silk and the scent of 1,000 crushed lilies, a heart can be buried just as surely as if it were laid beneath the damp earth of a churchyard. Today, at St. George's Church in Hanover Square, the ton has gathered to witness the social event of the season, the union of Lady Harriet Aubrey and the formidable Duke of Rothbury. But beneath the heirloom lace and glittering diamonds lies a secret of desperation, a father's ruin, and a love that was supposed to be dead. If this tale of high-stakes scandal and breathless yearning captures your soul, please subscribe and like to journey with us through history's most sweeping romances. We would love to hear in the comments, from which corner of the world are you listening, and do you believe a secret can ever truly stay buried? Chapter 1. The Gilded Sepulchre. St. George's did not feel like a house of God. To Harriet, it felt like a sepulchre carved from the coldest marble in England. The air was thick with the cloying scent of incense and the heavy, floral perfume of 500 aristocrats, yet it offered no warmth. Sunlight filtered through the towering stained glass, casting long, bruised shadows of violet and crimson across the aisle, as if the very windows were mourning the farce taking place below. Harriet stood at the altar, her breath coming in shallow sips that felt inadequate against the tightness of her corset. Her wedding gown was a masterpiece of Honiton lace and heavy white silk, an heirloom passed down through generations of women who had likely been far happier than she. To the observers in the pews, she was a vision of porcelain perfection. To herself, the lace felt like a shroud, its intricate patterns winding around her throat like a spider's web, binding her to a fate she had spent a lifetime trying to outrun.
Beside her stood the Duke of Rothbury. He was a man of iron and shadow, his presence so overbearing that it seemed to pull the oxygen from the very air. He did not look at her with the tenderness of a groom. He looked at her with the predatory satisfaction of a collector who had finally secured a rare, elusive prize. Every time he shifted, the faint, acrid scent of stale tobacco and expensive brandy wafted from his wool coat, a scent Harriet had come to associate with her own undoing. Her hand trembled as it rested in his grip firm and dry. He squeezed her fingers, not a gesture of comfort, but a warning. She remembered the carriage ride to the church, the way the Duke's eyes had remained as cold as flint while he leaned across the velvet bench. "Smile, Harriet," he had whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "If you so much as flinch at the altar, if you show the world anything less than the face of a blushing bride, your father will be in the Fleet by sunrise. I hold every scrap of paper he has ever signed, and I shall not hesitate to see him rot." The memory of her father's weeping face, his hands shaking as he confessed the depth of his gambling debts, burned in her mind. He was a weak man, a foolish man, but he was her father, and so she had stepped out of the carriage, donned the veil, and prepared to sacrifice her life to pay for her sins. As the rector's voice droned on, a rhythmic, hollow sound that felt miles away, Harriet's gaze fixed on a small silver scar on the palm of her left hand. It was a map of a different life. She had earned it 10 years ago on a wild, sun-drenched afternoon in Cornwall, climbing the treacherous cliffs near her family's estate. Gabriel St. John had been there. He had reached down to pull her up, his own hand calloused and warm, his laugh echoing against the sound of the crashing waves. "I've got you, Harry," he had said. "I'll always catch you." Gabriel, the son of a mere country squire, a man with no title and no fortune, but with a soul that caught fire whenever he looked at her. They had made promises in the dark, whispered vows that were never meant for a church, but were more sacred than any words spoken today. And then he was gone, accused, arrested, and vanished into the grey maw of the prison hulks, leaving her with nothing but a scar and a heart that had slowly turned to stone. "Lady Harriet," the rector's voice cut through her trance, sharper now, "do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a falling axe. Harriet looked up, her vision blurring behind the fine mesh of her veil. She looked at the Duke, who watched her with an expectant, cruel smirk. She looked at the rows of judgmental faces in the pews. None of them saw the woman screaming inside the silk. She opened her lips. The words "I do" felt like shards of glass in her throat. The weight of the lace grew heavier. The cold of the marble seeped through the soles of her satin slippers, and Harriet realized with a sudden, sickening clarity that she was about to die without ever having truly lived.
The rector's breath smelled of peppermint and ancient dust as he leaned closer, his eyebrows raised in a silent prompt. Harriet's lungs seized. The "I" was a ghost in her throat, the "do" a death sentence she could not pronounce. The Duke's fingers tightened on hers, his signet ring biting into her flesh, a physical reminder of the brand he was about to place upon her life. Then the world broke. It began with the violent, discordant groan of the great oak doors at the church's rear. They did not merely open, they were surrendered. The sound of iron bolts shearing echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a cannon blast, shattering the practiced, suffocating silence. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Harriet felt the Duke stiffen beside her, his hand dropping from hers as he spun towards the intrusion. She followed his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Framed against the blinding gold of the afternoon sun stood a spectre. He was a silhouette of defiance against the light. His coat, once fine navy wool, was torn at the shoulder, the fabric frayed and stained with the salt of the sea and the grime of the road. His boots were caked in the heavy red clay of 3 counties, and his hair, longer and wilder than Harriet remembered, was windswept and matted. He looked less like a gentleman and more like a man who had clawed his way out of the very earth to be there. "Stop this farce!" The voice was Gabriel's, yet it was changed. It was no longer the light, melodic baritone that had whispered poetry in the Cornish tallgrass. It was raw, ragged, and possessed a terrifying, resonant power. The rector staggered back, clutching his prayer book to his chest as if it were a shield. A low murmur rose from the congregation. "Is that St. John, the traitor?" Gabriel's eyes, burning with a frantic silver intensity, locked onto Harriet's. The distance of the long, floral-strewn aisle seemed to vanish. In that gaze, she saw the frost of a prison hulk, the scars of a man who had been broken but refused to stay shattered, and beneath it all, an unyielding, desperate love. "Harriet," he breathed, the name a prayer that carried through the cavernous space. "How dare you?" The Duke of Rothbury's voice was a low snarl, his face contorting into a mask of aristocratic fury. He stepped forward. "Vergers, remove this animal from the sanctuary. He is a convicted felon." Gabriel took a step into the church, his mud-caked boots treading upon the pristine white runner. He ignored the Duke entirely. "I told you I would come back for you, Harriet," Gabriel said, his voice cracking with the weight of years. "Did you truly think a prison hulk, or the lies of a coward, could hold me when you were still in the world?" Rothbury sneered. "He is a madman, Harriet. Do not look at him. Rector, proceed." 2 of the Duke's hired men-at-arms began to move from the shadows. The scandal was complete, yet the Duke seemed only interested in the possession of his prize. Harriet looked at the Duke, seeing the cold, calculating predator who had used her father's weakness as a snare. Then she looked back at Gabriel. He stood alone, bloodied and exhausted, a man with no title, no wealth, and a price on his head. Yet he was the only thing in the world that was real. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an awakening. With a sudden, violent motion, Harriet reached up and clawed at the pins holding her heirloom veil. She ripped the fine lace from her hair, the delicate fabric tearing with a sound like a dying sigh. She let it fall to the marble floor, a discarded shroud. "Harriet, stay where you are," the Duke roared, reaching out to grab her arm.
She dodged him with a grace born of pure desperation. She ran. Her heavy silk skirts hissed against the floor as she flew down the aisle. She ran past the shocked faces of the London elite, past her father's slumped, weeping form. She ran toward the man who smelled of rain and freedom. When she reached him, she didn't stop until she collided with his chest. Gabriel's arms wrapped around her instantly, pulling her into the heat of his body. He felt solid, frayed, and vibrantly alive. "You came," she sobbed into the salt-stained wool of his coat. "I will always find you," he whispered against her hair. "But we must go, Harry. We must go now." Chapter 3. Flight to the Moor. The world beyond the church doors was a blur of charcoal greys and rain-lashed greens. Gabriel had not come with a carriage. He had come with Boreas, a massive obsidian black stallion that looked as though it had been sired by the north wind itself. He swung Harriet onto the saddle with a strength that spoke of desperate miles travelled, then vaulted up behind her. With a single, sharp command, the horse lunged forward, his hooves striking the cobblestones like thunderclaps. They fled London as the sky finally broke, the clouds unleashing a torrential downpour that seemed intent on washing away the very memory of the morning's failed nuptials. Hours bled into a fever dream of motion. Harriet's arms were locked around Gabriel's waist, her cheek pressed against his back. She could feel the frantic, rhythmic beat of his heart against her own ribs, a steady drumline of survival. The wind whipped her hair, now free of its pins, into a tangled dark veil.
By the time they reached the moorlands of Moss End, the light had died, leaving the world a treacherous expanse of shadows and mist. The sanctuary was a charcoal burner's abandoned cottage, a hunched stone structure clinging to the side of a craggy hill. It was a place of dirt floors and draughty walls, far removed from the gilded cages of Mayfair. Gabriel lifted her from the horse, his hands lingering on her waist for a heartbeat before he led her inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old wood. He struck a flint, coaxing a single tallow candle into a flickering amber life. The light illuminated the wreckage of Harriet's finery. Her wedding gown was a tragedy of ruined silk. The hem was shredded and heavy with mud, the bodice translucent from the rain. She was shivering. "You're freezing," Gabriel said, his voice low. He stepped toward her, then hesitated. "You cannot stay in that dress, Harriet. The damp will take your lungs." I cannot reach the fastenings," she whispered. The gown was a labyrinth of silk-covered buttons designed for a lady's maid. Gabriel stepped into her personal space, the heat radiating from him like a furnace. "Allow me." He turned her around. Harriet felt the brush of his calloused fingers against the sensitive skin of her nape, and a jolt of pure yearning shot through her. His hands, scarred and roughened by whatever hell he had endured, moved with surprising tenderness. One by one, the buttons gave way. The silk loosened. As the bodice fell away, leaving her in only her thin chemise, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Gabriel did not pull away. His hands came to rest on her bare shoulders, his thumbs tracing the line of her collarbone. They stood there in the silence, two ghosts returned to life, the only sound the lushing rain against the roof, and the heavy, synchronized brum of two hearts that had finally found their way home. Chapter 4. The Ledger of Lies. The silence in the cottage was a heavy, vibrating thing, thick with the ghosts of the last 3 years. Harriet stood shivering in her camise by the meagre fire. Gabriel stood a few paces back, his hands clenched at his sides. 3 years, Gabriel, Harriet whispered. They told me you were dead. Then they told me you were a thief, that you had fled to the continent. Gabriel's face contorted. He reached into his sodden coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound volume, stained with seawater and grit.
I didn't disappear, Harriet. I was erased, he said, his voice gravelly. The night I was to meet your father, I was intercepted by agents of the Crown. They found uncut diamonds from the royal collection sewn into my saddlebags. I was tried in a closed court, branded a traitor, and thrown into a hulk. Harriet gasped. That's a hanging offence. It was meant to be, Gabriel said, stepping closer. But the man who put me there kept records. He opened the ledger. I didn't just escape. I tracked the man he paid to plant those stones. Before he died, he told me who had hired him, and he gave me this. Harriet looked down at the cramped, elegant handwriting. Her breath hitched. It was the Duke of Rothbury's script. It's all here, Gabriel said, his finger tracing a column of figures. The debts your father accrued? Rothbury owned the club. He instructed the dealers to cheat him, to ply him with drugged wine until he signed away everything. He manufactured the ruin of your house. Harriet felt a coldness seeping into her marrow. He hunted us. He removed you so there would be no one to defend me. He is a predator, Gabriel said, his eyes burning. He wanted your family's lineage to bolster his own new money. He thought I was a ghost, and he thought you were broken.
Gabriel took a final step, closing the distance until their chests almost touched. The ledger fell to the table, forgotten. He reached up, his thumb brushing a damp curl from her forehead. I have spent every night in the dark thinking of the scar on your palm, he whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. I didn't come back just to clear my name, Harriet. I came back to burn his world to the ground for what he did to you. The yearning that had been a dull ache for 3 years flared into a consuming fire. Harriet didn't care about the scandal or the ruined dress. She reached up, her fingers sliding into Gabriel's wild, damp hair, and pulled him down. When his lips met hers, it was the desperate, soul-deep reclaim of a man who had returned from the dead. Chapter 5. The Altar by the Sea. Weeks later, the scandal in London had reached its conclusion. The ledger, along with a sworn affidavit from a Bow Street runner Gabriel had tracked down, was delivered to the Home Office. The evidence was damning. The Duke of Rothbury, exposed as a conspirator and forger, fled to the continent just ahead of a warrant for his arrest. The debts against Harriet's father were declared null. The vengeance was complete, but Harriet and Gabriel did not stay to watch the wreckage. They fled towards the sun and the salt. The chapel of St. Govan sat on a jagged tooth of rock overlooking the Cornish coast. It was a humble thing, built of grey stone smoothed by centuries of salt-laden gales. There were no towering stained-glass windows here, only narrow slits that let in the raw, honest light of a dying afternoon. Inside, the air was filled with the wild, bracing perfume of the sea.
Harriet stood at the small, weathered altar, but she did not feel like a sacrifice today. She wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, her hair unbound and dancing in the breeze. Beside her, Gabriel stood in the clothes of a free man, a simple linen shirt and sturdy breeches. The scars on his face were not hidden. The priest was a man of the coast, his face as lined as a map of the local coves. He spoke the words with a gravity that acknowledged the fire they had both walked through. "I have no lands to give you, Harriet," Gabriel whispered as he took her hand. His grip was firm, warm, and trembled only with devotion. "I have no title to offer your name. I have only this heart, which has never belonged to anyone but you." "I have had enough of titles and lands to last a lifetime," Harriet replied, her eyes bright. She traced the silver scar on her own palm, then reached out to touch the matching line on his cheek. "I want only the man who caught me on the cliffs. I want the truth, Gabriel. I want you." They exchanged no gold rings encrusted with rubies. Instead, Gabriel produced 2 simple bands of hammered silver, forged by a local smith. As they slid them onto each other's fingers, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below rose in a crescendo,
a wild, rhythmic applause from the earth itself. There were no lords or ladies to witness the union, only the sea and the sky, and the truth of two souls finally at rest.
The scandal at the altar would be whispered about in London drawing rooms for decades, but for Harriet and Gabriel, the ton no longer existed. As they stepped out of the chapel and onto the windswept cliff, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and fire. They were no longer characters in a tragedy, nor pieces on a chessboard. They were simply two people, free and unburdened, walking towards a horizon that finally belonged to them. In the end, it was never about the grandeur of the cathedral or the weight of the lace. It was about the quiet strength of a promise kept in the dark and the courage to run towards the light when all seemed lost. True love is not found in the absence of fire, but in the strength of those who survive the flames together.